It was really accidental. I got downsized in 1983, some 40 years ago. I worked in marketing. I'd worked for Halston, but the company that owned Halston, this was when Halston was a great brand, so successful that in the United States it made more money than the whole of Max Factor, believe it or not. Anyhow, I got downsized. I'd always been fascinated by the problems department stores' perfumery have in selling fragrances. Um, Fragrance fascinates, and yet it frustrates. Allure magazine famously said that trying to find the right fragrance is almost as hard as trying to find the right partner.
I like that.
They're not far wrong on that. Um,
And we can be fickle with our affairs. We've all had a few affairs. We've all had a few faithful fragrances. We've all had the fragrance that's done us wrong and the ones that's broken our heart and lingers in the memory forever.
but the ones that linger in your memory, the ones that probably broken your heart, probably belong to one or two of the 14 different fragrance families. If you ask people for the names of their most favorite perfumes, and you get three or four, almost invariably, at least two of them will fall into the same family. But we don't know why. There's many theories, but there's no actual proof. All we know is that that happens. And when it comes to trying to find fragrances, we're faced with the problem. There's an avalanche of new fragrances in the last 10 years, for example, 2012 to 2021. We've tracked over 28,000 new fragrances. Imagine that.
It's incredible.
But there's an even deeper problem. There is no common language in fragrance. Each of the brands describes their fragrances differently. And each of the perfumers behind the scene, the great technical companies that create perfumery, have different technical classifications. So what we end up with is a cacophony of confusion. That meant that people, consultants at the counters, because they couldn't figure out which ones to suggest to you because they didn't really understand what you were talking about, they would tend to promote the perfumes that they themselves liked, which isn't very helpful.
Michael, one of the things that we've spoken about before, and certainly when I used to be a distributor of brands, I used to import L'Artisan Parfumeur. I imported La Perla, Penhaligon's, Ferrari fragrances. And, the explosion and the move away from a signature fragrance and the classics. I'd love for you to share, because a lot of the people who are listening now either have a signature fragrance or a wardrobe of fragrances that are their go-tos. And you've very kindly shared that we typically tend to like and choose fragrances from the same family. But let's talk about the originals. What are the classics that endure and in your mind and in your universe form the starting point for making that selection and categorization? Are there a handful of fragrances that have stood the test of time that are the original classics that endure today?
Yes, with pleasure. The fragrance that started it all was Jicky by Guerlain, Jicky by Guerlain in 1889. It's not an easy fragrance to wear, but it started it because it was the first that put a splash of synthetic notes into the naturals that were the basis of perfumery. I know people tend to think that synthetic notes are nasty, but they're not. They're the foundation of great perfumery. A great perfume is probably a blend of the finest naturals on a skeleton of innovative synthetics. And Aimé Guerlain, who created Jicky, when asked why he included synthetics, he said, because they gave me an effect I couldn't find in nature. I could follow through and say from Guerlain came Shalimar in 1925.
Which I still love.
Signature. Absolutely an amazing fragrance. Still today, even now, perfumers say, I wish I could create a new Shalimar.
It does feel like there's been, you think about the brands like Tom Ford or even Erin, and, Byredo. There's so many lovely niche fragrances that have resurfaced, and we're now quite comfortable paying 300, 400. I know Versace have just launched a collection of
Yes,
premium fragrances, and they're
yes.
gorgeous. They're gorgeous. So no more kind of discounted mass fragrances. All of the houses are now reinvesting. Certainly Joe Malone had an explosive effect on premium, lifestyle fragrances as well.
She was one of the early niche fragrance houses.
Where do you talked about, or we talked about the language you created and simplifying selecting a fragrance. And you're quite right. We're now having conversations online or listening to this podcast, and maybe you remember a fragrance that you were in love with many moons ago, and it informs your sense of what you like in a fragrance, but you're looking for something different.
Mm-hmm.
How would you say we start the journey of discovering a new fragrance for ourselves, maybe one that speaks to the woman or the man that we are now, but still captures, the happiest memories of our 20s?
Lovely idea. If I may, just before I go into that, to put niche into context. In the 1970s, there were 17 niche houses. In the 1980s, that expanded to 18 niche houses. In the 1990s, 180 new niche houses. Since the year 2000, we've tracked over 1,300 new niche houses.
That is so generous of you to share those findings, because I think that that's a wonderful place to start. And I love that you anchored it to, we can go back to something that we've worn before or loved before, and then seek recommendations. Before we finish, Michael, I know that you're working on a new book, and I'm so fascinated by this, and we've touched on it a little bit. You're publishing a new book on American classics and the impact of American fragrances. And I know that, we often look to France as the mothership of fine fragrances, but there have been other massive cultural influences. We've had the influx of oud and deep roses and quite rich fragrances from Arabic countries. We've definitely had a trend from Scandi fragrances, the clean notes, and Italian fragrances at a time were extremely successful. A lot of the designer fragrances are from Italian houses. What makes the American fragrance houses special, and what did they give us?
It's been fascinating. It's probably my last book. I've been working on it now for 30 years. When I checked, first interview was with Josephine Catapano, the perfumer who created Fiji for Guy Larache. That was in 1988.
That's a pretty fragrance.
Well, she also did Youth Dew for Lauder and Norel, the first significant American designer fragrance. I set out, nobody had done it before, I set out to trace the evolution of American perfumery from Bluegrass of 1934, Elizabeth Arden's first international success, through to, of course, Youth Dew of 1952. That was a gift to Mrs. Lauder. She really became fascinated with perfumery from 1968 with Estee. And that was probably the first American perfume that made even the French perfumers envious.
Interesting.
When you think of what she created, it's genius. Think of Estee of 68, Aromatics Elixir, still among the world's top-selling fragrances. Yep. 1971, Alliage 72, sports fragrance, Private Collection 73, White Linen 78.
And we've worn them all, and Beautiful.
Beautiful 85, the last one on which she worked. She transformed perfumery, not just American perfumery, from plonk to genius. Think of Charles Revson, a brutal man, a bully, but he had a finger that made you and I tick. He knew what we would buy. He created the first successful American designer fragrance in Norel, and Charlie, that transformed the perfume business. Think of Calvin Klein with the genius of imagery. I mean, the world was really into sex in the 1980s, and he gave us Obsession. We needed a break, so he gave us Escape. Then with business, he gave us Eternity, and finally Hugs and Sharing with CK1. Then you have to take into account the blockbusters of Giorgio. And now with the new niche fragrances, Chinatown by Bond No. 9, or for example, Santal 33 by Le Labo.
I
I could
love
go
Le
on and
Lauder.
on.
I
It's
absolutely love Le Lauder. I'm lost in their stores. I wear their jasmine fragrance. I have everything in it: the shower gel, the body oil, the perfume oil, the eau de parfum, all of it.
For me, this book has been the most extraordinary journey of my life because it is my life. I started in the 60s. I've lived through it. And what's interesting about this and Perfume Legends is it's not my words. I'm the word weaver. It's the words of all the people who created. It'll come out next year in Australia. It'll be here, I think, in October. So hold on for it.